On a hot February evening in 1986, a gang of 5 suburban thugs is drinking at a hotel near Blacktown in Western Sydney. They're burglars, armed robbers and rapists.
Whack!
And one is also an escaped prisoner on the run. At the same time, 40 kilometres away, in what might as well be another world, Anita Cobby, a 26-year-old nurse and former charity beauty queen, is having dinner at a city restaurant with 2 of her workmates. Within hours, she'll be abducted by the gang and tortured and raped and murdered.
Australia's most notorious criminal pageant. Infamous cases, birth house. Generation after generation. Crime Investigation Australia, Travers Supply.
News of the arrest spread quickly and a large angry crowd had already gathered by the time the 3 men were brought to court.
A storm of revulsion sweeps across Australia as the news breaks that 5 men from 3 distinct families, the Murphys, the Travers and the Murdochs, have been arrested for the senseless and brutal murder.
Late last night, more than 20 detectives raided houses in Wentworthville and Westmead.
The oldest in the gang that kills Anita Cobby is Michael Murphy, who's born in 1953 to Dulcie and Leslie Murphy. It's Michael who leads his younger brothers, Gary and Les Murphy, into a life of crime.
Michael Murphy was the eldest of 9 children. There were 2 girls and 7 boys, and Michael didn't really have a good time with his dad Les. He clashed a lot with Les, and by all accounts Dulcie was pretty hard on all the kids.
The family lives in the inner western suburb of Erskineville.
The police car was always down, double parked outside their house in Binning Street.
They were in trouble for stealing. They'd steal things from homes, they'd steal cars. But by the time Michael Murphy was 12, he was having real difficulty with his dad, so he moved out and went to live with his grandmother.
Michael's grandparents dote on him, and he leads a wild and mostly unsupervised teenage life. After leaving high school early, he works briefly at a car dealer's yard before returning to life as a thief. He's soon arrested and sent to a juvenile detention centre.
Apparently he was in boys' homes and being continually gang raped himself as a child in boys' homes, and apparently he wrote letter after letter after letter pleading for someone in the government to help him, and of course that was all ignored. So I feel very sorry for Mick, but he wasn't someone that I ever warmed towards.
On his release from the boys' home, Michael Murphy becomes part of a gang called the Sharpies. 2 of his younger brothers, Gary and Les, soon join him, carrying weapons and fighting the surfer and the bikie gangs.
Let him go. No, you can just get the hell out.
Wherever they go, it's Michael Murphy who takes the lead.
Go on, get out, both
that's
of you.
great. Okay.
Michael Murphy, who was the older one, who was always in trouble from all the records against him, and they're public, was sort of the leader, and Gary, not being the highest of intelligence, followed the leader, and Les, being the little brother, in stature as well as age, followed them.
The younger siblings, I think, were almost saying, you know, oh, Michael's respected both in jail and out on the streets. And I don't care what I do. If I end up in jail, well, he'll look after me and I'll be respected as well.
Oh, let's go, boys. Stuffer.
One of the Murphy's boys' hangouts is a Christian outreach centre in the city, run by the Reverend Fred Nile.
They did know how to fight. I don't know whether they used to go to a gym or somebody taught them to fight, or their father, but they certainly knew how to hit hard, right in the face, break a nose. But one night the phone rang, and it was Mick Murphy's mother, and she was saying to Mick, the police are hanging around the house at Gloom. If you're coming home with a stolen car, don't come home tonight. So that was the message, and I had to pass the message on to them. So obviously they were, at least in the car stealing business, or stealing cars just for transport.
As well as car stealing and burglary, the boys also branch out to mugging. The Murphys stage cruel personal assaults, bashing and robbing women in the street.
They had no money, so I guess they just lived off other people, and often I'd find the toilets would be blocked up, the cisterns in the toilets, and we'd lift off the lid and you find it stuffed with women's purses.
The Reverend also has serious trouble with older criminals who regard the Murphy boys and their followers as their helpers and trainees.
We did have one big brawl where another group came in, which I later found out were young older men, but still young men who'd come out of prison, and they tried to wreck the place one night and actually bashed me, and I had a 9 stitches put on my lip here. It was all cut with probably a bottle or something. I found out later they were upset, these older men, that I was actually influencing what they called the apprentices. These are the young blokes that they were actually helping to train into more serious crime.
The antisocial nature of the Murphys' personalities would have been developed and ingrained in them during, their childhood.
The Murphys' neighbours finally get some relief when the family moves away to the outer western suburbs into a housing commission home near Blacktown.
Very much working class, and also the lower socioeconomic unemployed. It wasn't far from Parklea Jail, so often single mothers used to live there because they were close to visiting at the jail.
And they started to gather new friends out there because they were with other people who were very much like them, who would truant school, not be employed, and be a bit bored, so they'd start drinking together.
And a lot of the crime went unreported because people in that area were just accepting it as part of life, and they almost became used to it.
The Murphy boys are soon well known to the local police.
Though they were going nowhere and probably going to repeat, because Mick's father was in prison, probably we're going to go down the same pathway. So it was a pretty antisocial, the world has nothing for us. We hate the world, perhaps.
They were our prime suspects for most of our, crime, like car stealing, car parts, breaking in, bag snatching.
Is that they did seem to have a big chip on their shoulder. And sometimes I know they would bash other people, and we'd have someone with a bleeding nose. But sometimes I've actually watched them, whether it was Mick, but I remember some of them, they'd actually just bash the wall. They'd actually just smash the wall until their knuckles were bleeding.
After finishing their shifts at Sydney Hospital, nurse Anita Cobby and two of her workmates have enjoyed a night out at a city restaurant.
Had a great time, three of us, just talking, making plans, generally being three young women, giggling, all that kind of stuff. And then we left. It wasn't a late night. We said goodbye to Elaine, and I asked Anita if she wanted to lift to the station, and I drove her to the station. She said, "I'll see you tomorrow." I said, "Yeah, see you then." And that was the last words we spoke.
It was a train trip Anita had taken all her life, but this one would be the last. In the Doonside Hotel near Blacktown in Western Sydney, the Murphy brothers have been drinking with two mates for most of the day. Michael Murphy has escaped from Silverwater Prison, where he's been serving an 8-year sentence for burglary and larceny. It's his second lengthy prison sentence, and at 29, he's spent most of his life in custody. As evening approaches, the gang decides to leave the hotel to buy drugs. They pile into a car they've stolen some days earlier, but it has little petrol, and the gang has no money. They decide to rob some vulnerable female, and while they're at it, to have what they call some fun, and rape her as well. With Michael Murphy constantly in and out of prison, his brother Gary, who's 5 years younger, steps into his shoes as the family protector. A congenital heart defect and a speech impediment, he's the quietest of the wild Murphy boys.
I've never met anybody who's more popular with girls than Gary, or has had more girlfriends. And remarkably, even whilst he's been in custody, he seems to have new girlfriends all the time. Like every now and then I'll get a phone call and go, I've got a new girlfriend now.
By all accounts, he was very popular with the women. Probably more so because he had a more gentle nature and quite a nice smile, and he was a bit smooth talking.
Gary was, he was more compliant. I mean, to your face. He'd, you know, when I was working, I'd come up and say, what do you got on you, mate? And he'd say, nothing, search me. And so, you know, you'd stop, search and detain and check him out.
But Gary's seemingly gentle nature hides a hair-trigger temper.
He would have bouts where he'd get into trouble with other men, though. He'd fly off the handle very easily, and he'd get into fights. He got barred from the Rudy Hill RSL for life for getting into a fight there, and because he drank a lot, he fought a lot.
As Gary gets older, his temper gets worse, particularly when he's drinking or smoking marijuana. He's caught stealing a motor vehicle and driving without a license, and he's placed in a juvenile home.
Shit!
After his release, he gets a job with a local builder who describes him as a good worker and a good kid. But he also uses his mechanical skills to work on stolen cars, changing their markings so that they can't be traced. Over the next 14 years, he's charged with multiple offences, with his specialties being home burglaries and car stealing. He even builds a master collection of keys to fit various types of cars.
One night I was on jetty and I stopped a young bloke, and there was a wire ring with about, it must have been 60, 70, I think, keys. And I noticed, I had a look at them, they were all car keys, like Holden keys. And I said, what do you got with these for, mate? And he said, I'm holding them for one of the Murphy boys.
When the younger Murphy brothers get into violent street fights, it's Gary who'd come to their rescue. Neighbours also tell of regular outbreaks of violence inside the Murphy home.
They would hear noises coming from the house and violence, but often they'd call the police there. But when the police went there, it was, which you see quite often, sadly, in domestic violence, where they clump together and actually the offender lies and the victim lies because they don't want police intervention.
They didn't have what you'd call a super upbringing. The father, I think, was quite violent to them. No education, on the drugs, on the booze, roaming around, petty larceny. Doesn't excuse anything, but there it is.
Incredibly poor, very uneducated, very violent, I think, home lives. And really, nobody was terribly bright.
I'd see Mrs. Murphy and and she often expressed her inability to control them. But at the same time, I heard on the streets that she was advising them not to steal cars, although she did say that, you know, don't steal cars, but in fact never get caught. So there was a philosophy in the family by Mrs. Murphy, I can't stop them, Mr. Raymond, but I don't want them to get caught and end up in jail.
The brothers appear regularly in court, charged with various stealing offences, and they're mostly given small fines and good behaviour bonds. And
often they didn't care about getting caught, but they knew that the threats they gave to the witnesses or victims, that they wouldn't be indicted, that we couldn't charge them.
The third Murphy brother, Les, is best described as a tough little nut who becomes a thief at the age of 10. But soon afterwards, he discovers that he can make a lucrative income by selling his body in the evil world of underage prostitution.
Les Murphy was the smallest of the Murphy brothers and quite a different sort of fellow to the other brothers. He had a real hard edge to him and he was quite intimidating. He would argue a lot, even with his brothers.
Les begins to hang out in an underground bar in King's Cross where young male prostitutes meet their clients.
And he was known to be the frequent companion of quite a few well-known Sydney figures.
He also works the streets, being picked up by men at night at the notorious High Stone Wall behind the New South Wales Supreme Court on Darlinghurst Road.
That famous wall by the very courts in which they were tried. Yeah, he was a young, underage male prostitute. And he would be on the wall.
At the age of 19, Les is charged with 2 counts of rape, and he's sentenced to 3 years in an adult prison. The older man who emerges is much tougher and more violent.
You know, you'd say, what have you got on you, mate? He'd say, who wants to know? And he'd rear up and get cranky. And I'd say, I'm just doing my job, mate. You know, that's all I'm doing. I'm just asking you. And he'd say, well, you're not searching me.
He leaves the world of prostitution to return to his proven skills in assault.
There was a bag snatch on 2 older women at Doonside as they came out of the Centrelink office where Les Murphy had jumped out of a car with another man and grabbed bags off 2 women. One of the women didn't let the bag go and he dragged her up the road as they jumped back in the car. So it was a common thing for them to get money that way.
Some were saying that they heard them speaking with some other local criminals and they were discussing the MO or methodology, the modus operandi of bag snatching, and it was never let go. Make sure that you hang on until the victim let goes, no matter what.
Nurse Anita Cobby has caught a late train home to the outer western suburbs of Sydney. She steps off the train at around 10 p.m. and finds there are no cabs at the station rank. Anita tries to call her parents from a public phone, as this is the era before mobiles, but all the phones have been vandalised. She decides to make the half-hour walk home. It's a warm summer's night, and this is Anita's home turf, the streets where she grew up, and she has no reason to feel that she's in any danger. Stranded at Blacktown railway station, Anita Cobby decides to walk home. A couple of blocks away from the station, she turns into Newton Road. The gang is driving around Blacktown in a stolen HT Holden, looking for a woman to attack.
You be looking for the preschool, eh, murder?
They turn into Newton Road, and here, 2 worlds collide.
Slow down, mate. Slow down, mate.
When Les Murphy is released from prison, he takes up a life of violent robbery, attacking women, stealing their bags. He moves in with girlfriend Lisa Travers, the sister of a young criminal named John Tavers, the man who will lead the gang attack on Anita Cobby. Born in 1967, Travers is the eldest of 7 children of bus driver Ken and his wife Sharon. He has a miserable childhood. His mother suffers from both physical illness and depression.
She was such a large woman that she would just sit in the house most of the time. And when she did go out, it became difficult for her to walk and breathe and do normal things like shopping and accompany her children to school.
His father apparently was incredibly violent to him, from what I understand. Anytime John showed any tenderness towards his sister, his father would bash him with a steel pipe, you know, as a child. That's what I'm told.
So he said on more than one occasion his father would choke him until he fell unconscious. So you can understand that he was exposed to a violent sort of environment from a very early age.
You almost always find in cases like his that the familial environment does not provide a normal socializing atmosphere in which a proper personality can evolve and develop.
Travers is still a boy when he begins stealing cars to go joyriding and get away from his violent and squalid home life. He spends much of his time committing petty crime, usually with an accomplice, his best friend, Mick Murdoch, who's quieter and much less volatile than Travers. The two have been mates for as long as they can remember, growing up in the same suburb of Doonside and wagging school together.
Michael Murdoch came from a single-parent family, and his mum was a pretty quiet sort of person, although when she first found out that her son Michael was smoking when he was 13, he was smoking marijuana with John Tavers, she ended up calling the police. She rang Sharon Travers and told her that they were smoking and she was going to dog them into the police to teach them a lesson. So their first conviction came at the age of 13 for smoking marijuana.
So how much do you reckon you got for that stereo in it last week? $20.
Mick idolises Travers, getting similar tattoos and body piercing, and joining him in getting drunk, taking drugs, and breaking into houses and stealing cars.
You know anyone that's not home? It's holidays. No one's home.
They were inseparable. They did everything together, and while they had other friends in a wider circle, John Tavers and Michael Murdoch were always together, and many of them did think they were twins because they had the same haircuts. They were quite lean in the face, about the same height. Many thought that they were homosexual lovers. They both denied that, although when they were arrested they were found in bed together naked, still denying that they were gay. Murdoch was a quiet sort of fellow, much quieter than John Tavers. He had a cold side to him, but probably not as cunning and as sadistic as John Tavers.
With a true psychopath, there is no emotional attachment to others. They are completely egocentric. The only thing that matters is their needs, their desires. Everyone else are just objects for their self-gratification, objects to be manipulated and exploited. And Murdoch would have clearly fallen into that category.
While Travers is displaying psychopathic tendencies, Mick is exhibiting some feelings and emotions.
Murdoch is more someone who, due to a lack of familial attachment, has sought out his emotional needs elsewhere. And he found it in his childhood associate, Travers.
The two are barely in their teens when they make a pact to be blood brothers, promising to be loyal until death.
Get it!
Anita Cobby's abduction in Newton Road is witnessed by two teenagers, a brother and sister, in a nearby house. The boy runs out to try to help, but just as he gets to the car, it speeds away.
They were driving around the car after they got her, and they stripped her off pretty well straight away in the back of the car. They'd punched her. Her nose was broken. Both the cheekbones had abrasions on them. Someone holds a knife at her throat, tells her to be quiet, punches her, lays her down on the floor behind the front seats, and someone fills up with petrol. They go to a handbag. They took the money out of her purse.
Shut up.
Paid for the petrol, and then went down to Green Park to carry on with it.
Sunday, the 2nd of February, 1986. 26-year-old nurse Anita Cobby has been abducted by a gang of thugs. She's bashed and raped in the back seat of a car as the gang heads for a deserted back road in nearby farmland. Two teenagers have witnessed the abduction and report the incident to their older brother when he arrives home moments later.
Drag her in the car and drive off up the road that way.
John Travers grows up to be a sexual predator after getting a bizarre introduction to sex in his youth.
He was encouraged by his father to take girls under the house so that his father could sneak and secretively watch what went on. So he would have a very distorted concept of morality.
Travers is expelled from high school after exposing himself to a teacher. Soon afterwards, his father leaves home, and Travers begins to steal poultry from neighbours to feed his siblings. At other times, he sits on the back porch shooting birds, which he then plucks and cooks for the family's dinner. It's at this time that he develops a new and sadistic streak.
The psychologist's report says that he was certainly interested in witchcraft, and he was cruel to animals, and this was probably or possibly born out of his difficulties that he had with his father. Neighbours told me, and there was evidence presented to the court, that he would be unkind to birds. He would throw stones at them, then stun them, and then catch them and kill them slowly.
Mick Murdoch's mother, Rose, strongly disapproves of her son's friendship with Travers and even moves to another suburb trying to separate them.
Give it to the slut. She loves it.
But Mick stays close to his mate, and they spend their days around a suburban pool hall where they pick up young girls, many of whom are subjected to sexual attacks.
Yeah, Johnny, you're right. Wrecked the man.
They begin to prowl the local railway stations looking for girls to rape, with Travers always the leader of the pack.
They're actually forced down, usually in premises and sometimes in public parks, forced down and their clothes taken off them, particularly underwear, and then, viciously raped, And with assaults too. But again, with the threats, you tell anyone about this and I'll kill you.
He also goes out hunting for men that he suspects of being homosexual and then raping them.
Travers' sexual drive was simply nothing to do with love or romance, or it was just simply sexual gratification. Just a few minutes, gratified, no matter, from what we hear, no matter who it was or what it was, he just wanted that sexual gratification and couldn't care less about the object of that gratification, whether it was anybody, human, animal, or whatever.
A psychopath like Travers doesn't see human sexuality in the normal way that people do. He doesn't see it as a form of emotional and physical interaction and attachment with others. He sees sex as something that he can use to demonstrate his dominance of people. He sees it as something that he can use to exploit others. He sees it as something that he can use to degrade others. And it doesn't matter whether the object of that is male or female. It's all the same to him.
His depravity deepens as he begins stealing larger animals and committing ugly atrocities on them. It's not long before he gains a reputation for bestiality.
That he had tendencies towards violence with animals, and there were suggestions that he had involved in sexual behaviour with animals.
One of his neighbours talked about the night that he had a sheep in the yard. He had jumped on its back and had sex with it, and while he was doing that, he pulled its head back and cut its throat, and then he put it on a spit, and it became a barbecue.
Rumours also circulate among locals that Travers is responsible for at least a dozen sex attacks on local girls.
At different times he was aggressive, and he would go in and out of that aggression depending on what he was on, and he took drugs and he drank a lot and he experimented with those drugs. A lot of marijuana, a lot of hard alcohol. He'd drink, in the end he was drinking a bottle of spirits a day towards the end of being on the run and being caught.
Who was that bird you were with? Don't even know.
Fearing one of his rape victims might be able to identify him to police by the distinctive teardrop tattoo under his left eye, Travers flees interstate.
Travers and some of his mates, including Michael Murdoch, took a drive from Sydney across the desert and went to Mandurah, just below Perth. And they'd been buying drugs and stealing things. So they came to the notice of police for stealing first up. And one of the men that they got to know over there was a young fellow in his teens.
At first, the teenagers welcomed into the group, but after a few days, Travers suddenly turns on him and he's viciously raped.
Threatened to cut his throat at the same time, and thankfully for some reason he didn't do that. And so he used to get strange gratification out of these. It wasn't even ritualistic, it was simply just a physical thing.
It was quite a brutal rape. The victim, the young man, had a lot of bruising, some broken ribs. He was so terrified that he didn't want to tell police, but the injuries were so severe that they were determined to press ahead and charge John Travers. So they did put an alert out for his car, but he managed to escape.
Wanted by Western Australian police for the rape, Travers and Murdoch return to Sydney, where they meet up with Gary and Les Murphy.
One of them's going in. Don't get that one in. Yeah, good one, mate. Didn't even get that one.
This is the gang that will soon commit the terrible crime that will define the rest of their lives.
Anita Cobby is bashed and raped in the back seat of the gang's stolen car as they drive her to Reen Road at Prospect, near Blacktown, in Sydney's western suburbs. It's poorly lit, well known as a lover's lane and a dumping ground for stolen cars.
I think by the time she got down there, one if not two, they probably already had sex with her in the car. So she'd been forced through the barbed wire fence rather than thrown over it or helped over it, absolutely dragged through it. And as I said, she had defensive wounds where she tried to stop doing what they were doing with the knife. She grabbed the knife and they pulled it out of her hands. Knuckles and fingers were broken. They'd had sex with her. Nothing more worse that you could think of.
Egged on by the Murphys and Murdoch, Travers commits the final atrocity.
Seen all that face?
They were talking about whether they should let her go or what should happen, and it was decided, because she had heard their names and that she'd seen their faces, that she couldn't live. She was lying face down at that point, and John Tavers jumped on her back and grabbed her by the back of the hair. She was conscious at that time because the coroner said that she had defence wounds on her hand, and she put her hand up to stop that knife, and he'd almost severed several of her fingers.
Leaving her naked body lying in the field, the 5 killers take Anita's clothes to Travis's home and burn them in the backyard. Anita is reported missing that night, but it'll be 2 days later, on the 4th of February 1986, that farmer John Reen sees his cattle all gathering under a tree, and he goes to investigate.
I just couldn't believe it was a human there laying in the paddock. I thought it was, a doll or something at first.
The horrified farmer calls police, who quickly descend on the scene, followed soon afterwards by media helicopters.
She had suffered a cut throat and lacerations to her naked body, consistent with falling on a barbed wire fence.
As barbaric details become known, the murder makes international news.
It was a crime that really created an enormous amount of community and media attention.
A massive reward of $100,000 is offered for information, and gradually public assistance puts both Travers and the Murphys among the chief suspects. The stolen car proves to be the key.
Well, someone came forward and gave us a report that they had information that the Murphy brothers and Murdoch had been seen in a car of that type. There were other people that just came forward and gave information about John Travers and others. And eventually we got information from another person in relation to the car. They put us onto the car and those that had possibly stolen the car, and it was the car we were looking for.
The first of the 3 men charged was arrested late last night, more than 20...
Detectives arrest Les Murphy, and soon afterwards they locate Travers and Murdoch naked in bed together at a house in a neighbouring suburb. A large blood-stained knife is found hidden under the mattress.
John, tell me more about the knife.
When Travers is interviewed, he denies any involvement, but his crude denial only makes detectives more certain of his guilt.
You didn't kill Anita Cobby with it? I didn't slit that slut's throat.
The real breakthrough comes when a female acquaintance of Travers, later to be known as Miss X, comes forward with shocking information about him.
And he had a habit of confiding in her about a number of his escapades, including his behaviour towards women, violent behaviour, and she was able to give us a profile, if you like, of Travers' activities and his attitude towards women, which involved a high degree of violence.
Shut up. Shut up.
Included in the information Miss X gives police are details of the brutal rape Travers committed in Western Australia. She tells them about how proud he was as he told her the whole gruesome story, and it was then she realised he was completely out of control.
Miss X agrees to secretly record conversations with him in which he reveals the shocking truth.
And Miss X went down to the cells, wired up. She was shaking. She was terrified.
During that conversation, he confessed to the kidnapping and murder of Anita Cobby.
What you're about to hear is the actual voice of John Travers, coldly admitting to raping and murdering Anita Cobby. You'll also hear the actual words used by Miss X. To protect her identity, her voice has been substituted by an actress.
John, come close. Why'd you have to stop her? She saw your faces. She got your names. And you knew? The other said you had to do it. Who said it had to be done? You? You all agreed? That's not your thing, John, is it? You haven't done it before, have you? Truthfully, that's the first. Don't laugh, it's not funny, John. And the rotten bastards all fucked off on you. Dear John, I still love you.
She was an amazing lady and she stood very strong in court. She never wavered from her story. She wanted to give that evidence because she knew that if she didn't, John Travers would commit another crime like that again.
A massive manhunt is launched for the other two Murphy brothers, Michael and Gary. And they're eventually arrested in a house at Glenfield in southwestern Sydney.
The tactical response group swooped just before 10 p.m.
News that 5 men have been charged with the rape and murder of Anita sets off a wave of revulsion right across the nation.
It was enormous. There was huge crowds outside the Blacktown police station. There was nurses hanging from the building opposite with a dummy made up hanging in a noose. There was no doubt if the public had the opportunity to get their hands on these offenders, we wouldn't have seen them again.
Let the public fix them!
The intensity of the public reaction terrifies other members of the families. Another of the Murphy boys, Bernie, a petty offender on the run from police, told newsmen he feared for his life.
That's pretty scary, you know, just seeing that, you know, and especially for my brothers, it must have been hard for them. Oh, I'm scared. I'm just scared to go to jail because I think what's been said may happen, and I mean, like, I don't want it to happen to me.
I think the elements that angered the public the most were that an innocent woman had been attacked by 5 men, 3 of them from the one family.
The gang of 5 really consisted of three close-knit brothers and two friends who were also mates. But on the night of the kidnapping, they operated as one unit. There's no doubt about that.
The brief, routine appearance was marked by more tight security. By now, the crowd had grown larger and more hostile.
When the Murphy brothers, John Travers and Michael Murdoch, are interviewed, the police find them quite cooperative. They're all eager to tell their story. But like all cowards, they try to blame each other.
They admitted that they had had sex with her, and they gave us some details in relation to what other people had done to her. But on the whole, their efforts were to minimise their roles and blame everyone else.
But I do think John Tavers was probably the ringleader and the one that actually conducted the murder, because he had that violent streak with a knife and so on. I never ever have seen any knives mentioned with the Murphy boys.
He was serving 24.5 years.
Miss X receives death threats, including one on the phone from Michael Murdoch's mother.
It's not an easy task for a witness, for any witness, in giving evidence in a murder trial. In this particular case, probably harder on this particular informant because she had been a close friend and confidant of Travers. She also knew others in the group.
Travers' fury is obvious as she steps up to give evidence at the coronial inquest.
He did try and make a grab for her, and which was quite a surprise. No one was expecting it, although he was being watched quite closely, and he did threaten her.
I'll kill you! Get off him! Get off him!
Threatened her family, and he did try and attack her, and she was very frightened, but she did stand her ground and she kept giving her evidence.
Miss X has her identity changed, and she and her family are moved to a new secret location. The 5 men stand trial in the New South Wales Supreme Court some 13 months after Anita's murder. John Travers, knowing the evidence against him is overwhelming, suddenly changes his plea to guilty. The trial of the other 4 lasts 2 months, and the defendants shock Australia with their callous attitude, laughing and sniggering in the dock as the gruesome details of Anita's murder are described to the jury.
Their demeanour in court was probably one of smugness, I suppose.
The boys were giggling and smirking and carrying on.
They certainly didn't take the court proceedings seriously all the time, because they did joke and talk amongst themselves.
Yes, and there were times that there were some glaring advances towards us, the investigators, and towards the crowd or towards the prosecutors.
Michael Murdoch probably was the one who seemed to show a little bit more remorse than the others.
I can say from sitting in that court, from the period it started to the period it finished, I don't believe they showed any remorse whatsoever for the crime that they committed.
The jury finds all 4 men guilty, and they're sentenced to life in prison.
When we got out of the court after they'd all been remanded for sentence, we walked out. I recall a bus driver, and there was a classic photo in the paper of a bus driver doing a little jig along the streets out the front, throwing his hat in the air, yelling out, "They're guilty, they're guilty." And it was reminiscent of that dance when the war was over.
I didn't have a great deal of empathy for the offenders. It was a classical, needless crime.
I did go into the jail to see the Murphy brothers, and I saw Michael Murphy and Les Murphy and Gary Murphy. I found them all to be very, very different in their personalities and their demeanour. Les Murphy was intimidating. The manner that he spoke was one of anger and aggression and violence. Michael Murphy and Gary Murphy were a little more subdued, and they were quite remorseful at times about the crime and their involvement in it, but I felt that both of them believed that they shouldn't have been committed of the crime.
Many psychiatrists have tried to explain how these men could lose all respect for their fellow human beings, how they could callously ignore pleas for mercy and take such pleasure from human suffering, while others with equally miserable childhoods do not turn out to be torturers and rapists and killers.
Travers and 2 other prisoners tried to escape through a van.
No, I don't think someone like a Travers could be rehabilitated in our current state of knowledge, and therefore, I think his file was annotated, never to be released, and I would suggest that's probably appropriate in this case.